There we go. Right. Um, Really nice to see you all this evening on a cold Sunday evening. As you may be aware, we've got 1 week until Hanukkah begins next Sunday evening. Works out this year that actually it's Sunday to Sunday. First night and last night are Sundays, so which is great. There's lots going on as a result, and a lot of ability to do stuff other than during the week. And as a result, I thought it might be a good opportunity this evening, a week before it starts, to think a little bit about what Hanukkah is about. What I'd kind of like to do is I've got a bunch of texts, and I don't want to just talk the whole time. I like to hear what other people think. But we'll kind of want to work backwards, starting with the more recent rabbinic texts about what Hanukkah is, and going back to the original primary sources. So we're going to go back for about 1,000 years, from around the 9th century to the 1st century BCE, which is when the story of Hanukkah actually happens. And the idea, I think, is trying to understand actually what Hanukkah is about and who the Maccabees were, Maccabean, the hammers, understanding who these people were, what the story that we tell is about, why we tell the story that we tell, and perhaps what its significance is to contemporary modern life, which I think there is some, more than just fried food, which is great. So before we do so, just curious, you could welcome to take yourself off mute. Wonder what people would say if I asked you what Hanukkah is about broadly. What would you say if someone asked you what Hanukkah is about? You're all on mute, so you gotta take yourself off to say.
Lighting candles.
Lighting candles, okay.
A miracle.
A miracle. What's the miracle that we're talking about?
Well, the extension of the oil.
Right, the extension of the oil, right? The oil that lasts a lot longer than we expected. Anything else that you'd say Hanukkah is about? Lighting candles, oil?
Well,
A military victory.
there's two narratives.
Okay, I see.
One with the miracle, and then there's a bog standard fight the Greeks.
Okay.
And you
Good.
can separate them into two things. So which one came first?
Oh, that's a good question, right? Well observed, David. Gwendolyn had said, I think it was Gwendolyn, had said something about a military victory, which is, of course, that fighting the Greeks part. There she is. Yeah. Rotem, what were you going to say?
Similar, I was about to say winning of the weak and the small over the strong and the powerful.
Very good, right? The kind of underdog story, how the unlikely heroes won the day. All of those things do coexist in our telling of what Hanukkah is about. But as David, of course, a historian, correctly perceives, there's an order to them. Something comes first and something comes later. And what I kind of want to do by looking at the sources and working backwards is try to understand a little bit about what Hanukkah started as and what it became. And then maybe they'll tell us something about what it can be for us. So I've just put everything in English for everyone's ease this evening, but hopefully can you see that? Yeah? Cool. So the first thing that I want to take a look at, and the most recent, is this paragraph, which you may be familiar with, called Alhanissim. This is an addition to the Amidah that we say during the days of Hanukkah. So every Amidah that we say during the days of Hanukkah, 3 times a day, the rabbis have instructed us for a long time since to add this paragraph. We don't only do it on Hanukkah, but there's another paragraph that's very similar, except the details of the historical event are changed, that we also add on Purim. So there's 2 versions of Alhanissim. There's the Purim one and the Hanukkah one. Purim and Hanukkah, of course, share the fact that they're the 2 Jewish holidays which are not in the Torah. And as a result, they're dealt with differently. There's no work restrictions, and they are included by the rabbis in terms of prayer. By virtue of this prayer, they get added to the Amidah Alhanissim. So just going to read a little bit of this and draw our attention to a little bit of this, which I think helps to give us a sense. This is the most recent, as I said, of the things we'll look at. So this is what we say. We say, we thank you, that's God, also for the miraculous deeds and for the redemption and for the mighty deeds and the saving acts wrought by you, as well as for the wars which you waged for our ancestors in ancient days at this season. In the days of the Hasmonean Matthias, son of Yochanan the high priest, and his sons, when the iniquitous Greco-Syrian kingdom rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and to turn them away from the ordinances of your will, then you, in your abundant mercy, rose up for them in the time of their trouble, pled their cause, executed judgment, avenged their wrong, and delivered the strong into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and insolent ones into the hands of those occupied with your Torah. Both unto yourself did you make a great and holy name in thy world, and unto your people did you achieve a great deliverance and redemption. Whereupon your children entered the sanctuary of your house, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, kindled lights in your holy courts, and appointed these 8 days of Hanukkah in order to give thanks and praises unto your holy name. It's a bit wordy. The English doesn't help here. From this, assuming that all you knew about Hanukkah was this prayer that we say every day of it, Alhanissim, of which there's many song versions as well. We sing the first line of this as a song frequently. What does this tell you that Hanukkah is about? Who are the characters? Who are the good guys and the bad guys? And what's the theme?
Switched off. There's a sound of.
It would
The victory of a minority over oppressors.
Right, okay, minority victory, right? David, what were you going to say?
Yeah, it will appear that there hasn't anything gone wrong here, but surely Judah, when he was running a guerrilla warfare, was successful. The minute he wanted set-piece battles, he got into deep trouble. And this is not nuanced at all. This is 100 or 900 years later or whatever, and it's a song of triumph.
Right, very good. The triumph of the minority, absolutely. Debbie, is that what you're going to say?
Yeah, no, basically, it's fine. I didn't have anything else to add.
I have a little bit of a theater.
Yeah.
So it made me think about, when Javert in Les Mis is standing and basically saying, I'm the righteous, I'm the one who's following God, I know the way. So there is a feeling of it here, of kind of like the people who has the Torah, the righteous that are small but strong, and they are the one who needs to know the way and win. Basically.
Really nice. Absolutely, right? The coincidence of the small, the weak, the ones who have the Torah, and the righteous ones who God is on their side, against the baddies. Who are the baddies here?
The Greeks again.
Right, so they label it the iniquitous Greco-Syrian kingdom. It's not exactly what it says in the Hebrew, but of course we know exactly who this is. This is the Selucid Kingdom, which was one of the 4 kingdoms that were created when Alexander the Great died. Alexander the Great had conquered the land of Israel, one of many, many, many conquerors of it in the last millennium BCE. Conquered it around 330. He only actually continued to rule for about 12 years, and then it was divided amongst his 4 generals, as the story goes. Actually, that's more complicated, but as usual, story goes, it was divided amongst his 4 generals, and 4 empires resulted, named after the people who they were given to often. One of them, and the one who got the territory in which the province of Judea was situated, was called the Seleucid Empire. And it's described here as Greco-Syrian because it was a combination of the Hellenistic culture of Alexander's empire, which of course was itself a combination of Greek and Persian culture, but heavily influenced by the local Syrian population, and as a result slightly different than the others. Right, the other kingdoms, the closest one nearby was the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, which again had a slightly different tone because of a more Greek and Egyptian merger as opposed to Greek and Syrian merger. The whole idea of Alexander's reforms and his procedure was to make everything assimilated into one unified culture. And that's what Hellenism was. It was a dominant and very clever strategy by virtue of an empire to kind of fuse all of the different cultures that were existent at the time into one cohesive culture. They did this via religion, among other things. And the way that they did it via religion was just to say, yes, the chief god of our pantheon is the same as the chief god of your pantheon, so we can just worship them together, right? And we can call them by each other's names, and we can put our statues in your temple and your statues in our temple, and everyone will basically get on with their own practices, while understood in the context of an overarching narrative of Hellenism broadly. And that, of course, didn't work for the Jews, not only because their religious practices didn't fit the religious practices of the other people of the empire, but also because they're just really, really stubborn, and most people didn't want to assimilate into the culture. So we usually say, right? Our usual claim is that most Jews resisted Hellenism, and as a result, the Maccabees, who of course were one family, and here they mention a guy named Matthias Matityahu, who was indeed the son of one of the claimants to the high priesthood, was the leader of this rebellion. He famously had 5 sons, and his sons and him and their little army started to be called by the nom de guerre of Hamaccabi, right? So his sons are Yehuda Hamaccabi and Shimon Hamaccabi and whatever else. It's not actually their name. It's a nom de guerre. It's a nickname, and of course, it's a very effective nickname in times of battle because it means the hammer. So his kids ended up being Judah the Hammer and Simon the Hammer, and etc. So the story that we usually tell, and that's told here, is about how this family, tiny minority, led a rebellion against the whole empire, the evil empire of the Greco-Syrian kingdom, the Seleucids, and of course they won because God was on their side. And as David said, there's a bit more nuance, of course, to the reality of the time. And it's a little bit less clear how it ends up becoming this. What's absent from all the things we discussed before we looked at this? What's missing from this text? What part of the story, Gwendolyn?
The miracle.
The miracle, yes. The storybook miracle. Not here. Interesting. It's not here. There's no mention of oil and it's magical, lasting for 8 days when it's supposed to only last for 1 day. That comes from somewhere else. Now, it does come from somewhere earlier. So it's interesting that the rabbis who composed this prayer chose to exclude it, because it comes from a passage in the Talmud, which is a couple hundred years earlier than the Alhanissim prayer, which is this passage in the Tractate of Shabbat. Someone else want to read this for us? Any volunteers?
I'll read it.
Yeah, Gwendolyn.
What is Hanukkah? For our rabbis taught, on the 25th day of Kislev commence the days of Hanukkah, which are 8 on which a lamentation for the dead and fasting are forbidden. For when the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they defiled all the oils therein, and when the Hasmonean dynasty prevailed against and defeated them, they made search and found only 1 cruse of oil which lay with the seal of the high priest, but which contained sufficient for 1 day's lighting only. Yet a miracle was wrought therein, and they lit the lamp therewith for 8 days. The following year, these days were appointed a festival with the recital of Hallel and thanksgiving.
Okay. Lovely reading, thank you. This is the origin of the oil miracle story. This is the only text that tells that story. And as you can see, it's not repeated in the ones that come after it. In the Alhanissim prayer, it does reference miracles, but doesn't say specifically this miracle. And it doesn't exist beforehand, which should beg the question, why are the rabbis asking a question they know the answer to and giving the wrong answer? Right, so the passage begins, my Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah? And they say, oh, Hanukkah is this 8-day festival where we don't do anything sad, right? Like all holy days, all holidays, all Yamim Tovim. Instead, we remember this miraculous oil thing that happened. What don't they mention here?
No battles.
The Maccabee.
Yeah. No battles, right? They don't mention any particular characters. They mention the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, which is the name of the dynasty that the Maccabees end up founding after they win the war. But they're very non-specific about who exactly is involved. They don't mention Matidyahu ben Yochanan ben HaKohen HaGadol, right? They don't talk about how the leader of the rebellion was the son of the high priest or one of the high priests. They don't talk about the victory against the evil empire. They talk about the fact that what we're commemorating is an almost naturalistic miracle in which something lasted much longer than it should. Why might we suggest or think that they do this?
Sorry to interrupt, Adam, because
Yeah.
then they're talking about the Greeks entering the sanctuary, but then there isn't, there's no background or whatever as to why. I mean, without a battle with the Greeks, why would the Greeks be entering the sanctuary? There's nothing to kind of explain that.
Ah, very, very keen observation, Debbie. Why did the Greeks enter the sanctuary? In what context were the oils defiled? How did it come about that the Maccabees needed to rededicate the temple, which is what Hanukkah means? Lehanech is to dedicate something, or in this case, to rededicate it. That's the question they're not answering, right? Rabbis are very good about answering some questions and not others. And whenever we look, especially at the Talmud, we have to wonder what it is that they're trying to answer and what it is they're trying to avoid answering. So we're going to come back to this. But keep in mind the approach of the Talmud, of the rabbis, and their lack of detail about some things. We're going to go back a little bit further in time, a little time travel here, to a guy named Josephus. Does anyone know who Josephus was? David, you must.
I've got him.
Who's he?
He was a protege of Vespasian, actually, or Vespasian's son Titus. He adopted the family name.
That's right. It's obvious. Yep.
He turned his coat, actually, and surrendered to the Romans.
Very good. So you can see this is written in around 95 CE, around the same time that the Gospels are written. Josephus is a very interesting character. He is one of our only historical records for the first century and the events that happened therein, and for earlier Jewish history before then. He is an extremely unreliable narrator, precisely because his life is one about betraying and changing sides several times, arguably. He claims that he was one of the leaders of the rebellion against Rome, and involved with the zealots, who were the extremists, and that he then, as David said, kind of turned himself in, changed sides, worked for the Romans, and was actually apparently in some way adopted by the very same family of the emperor who was the one who burned Jerusalem to the ground. He devotes the rest of his life to writing the history of the Jews, presumably from a Roman point of view as a kind of historical antiquity. Like, how interesting these people who used to exist, this is what their history was like, which the Romans loved. The Romans were fascinated by peoples that at their time seemed ancient. And as a result, they were quite taken by the Jews because they were curious about them. So Josephus comes to explain to a Roman public, writing in Latin, writing with the surname of the emperor, who these Jewish people were and what their history was. As a result, he again has his own point of view. But in his narration in the book, The Antiquities of the Jews, in his narration, he also explains the events that we know as those that become Hanukkah. And he explains it in an interesting way that, again, gives us a little bit more information as we're going back in time. Someone want to read this one for us?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
So on the 25th day of the month of Kislev, which the Macedonians call Apelius, they lighted the lamps that were on the candlestick and offered incense upon the altar and laid the loaves upon the table and offered burnt offerings upon the new altar. Now Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days and omitted no sorts of pleasures thereon. But he feasted them upon very rich and splendid sacrifices, and he honoured God and delighted them by hymns and psalms. Nay, they were so very glad at the revival of their customs, when after a long time of intermission, they unexpectedly had regained the freedom of their worship. that they made it a law for their posterity that they should keep a festival on account of the restoration of their temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it Lights. I suppose the reason was because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that thence was the name given to that festival.
Thank you. Well, what does Josephus know and what doesn't he know?
He doesn't know about the oil.
He doesn't know about the oil, or at least he doesn't talk about the oil. If he does know about it, we presume he doesn't because the rabbis made it up above. He also doesn't know the name.
He doesn't talk about a war or a battle.
He doesn't talk about... Yeah, no, exactly. He doesn't talk about a battle. He does elsewhere describe a little bit about the battle, but here he focuses on the ritual. And the ritual in particular is the resumption of sacrifices, right? And 8 days of which he hints a little bit at the language he uses with the burnt offerings on the altar and the loaves upon the table and the incense and all these detailed priestly regulations around the temple practice. There's a suggestion, which is not exactly in this passage, but earlier, that during the course of the war, the temple was occupied during the holiday of Sukkot. And because it was occupied during the holiday of Sukkot, the Jews were not able to offer the sacrifices involved in Sukkot. And those who have been to Shul on Sukkot will know from the Torah readings therein that the holiday of Sukkot had a huge amount of animal sacrifices. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of animals were killed every year on Sukkot. And it's almost suggested that actually Hanukkah is a replacement for Sukkot, that it's this thing that happens afterwards. When the Maccabees restore the temple, they redo what they were supposed to do. It seems to be the focus of all the animal sacrifices. And he talks about they were so glad they were able to regain the freedom of their worship. They made this a festival forevermore. We still do it, and we call it Lights. I don't actually have the Latin in front of me, but it's clear that whatever the word is that he's using is not the same as the word for Hanukkah. He's calling it by a different name, and he doesn't know why. Right? We call it Lights. I suppose the reason was, for the name, because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us like lights, and that thence the name was given to the festival. Doesn't make any sense. He gives a nonsense explanation for a name which is not the name we know the festival by. But it is interesting that he knows it, despite his focus on sacrifices, as a festival which is called Lights, which of course makes sense to us, because we think of Hanukkah as the festival of light. So maybe there's some hint here that the focus was on the menorah, on the oil, on the miraculous, nature of lighting the menorah again, because why else would it be called that in his time? Here, this is only 200 years after the events of Hanukkah, the confusion is evident. He, who knows Jewish history better than anyone else, doesn't know what the name is and why the name that people use is the name that they use. He's baffled by it. Which is quite strange.
He's also giving us this hint about the Apelius. What's Apelius? It's a pagan festival. Because
yes.
Wasn't the temple meant to have been made impure on pagan festival? And so that's why they rededicated it on the pagan festival.
Ooh, that's interesting. I don't know exactly what he's referencing with the word Apelius. I think it's the month. He's trying to tell us this is the same time as what the Greeks, he calls them the Macedonians, which of course, again, this is Alexander the Great's descendants. But I think presumably there is something there that's relevant to his readership, who are mostly Romans, to indicate to them what's happening here. This is kind of written as almost a very indulgent thing for the educated Romans to be like, oh, look at these crazy Jews and their crazy stories and what happened to them, right? And Josephus is the one to write it because he's got the credit. He lived through the war that took place between 66 and 70, which resulted in the destruction of the temple and the beginning of the diaspora. And he, is the great revealer of secrets about Judaism to the Roman public. Although we're very glad that he was, because otherwise we wouldn't know much about this time period. That's the trick. So we're quite reliant on Josephus to understand much about this time period, including stuff relevant to Christianity as well. Not too many people actually wrote stuff down, unfortunately. So he's got his own interesting agenda. He's avoiding, as someone pointed out, talking a great deal about the battle and the victorious Maccabees, who he doesn't mention. Right? He doesn't talk about any individuals. He talks about Judah, but doesn't really say much more about who this Judah character is. And presumably that's because he's lived through in his own lifetime a time in which a guerrilla warfare endeavor against a great empire failed horribly and everyone ended up dying. So there's a bit of a sensitive view of exactly what this battle was about, perhaps, and worry that maybe if he makes too much of a fuss about the battle thing, it might sound a lot like what happened in his own lifetime that he participated in rebelling against Rome for similar reasons, he might think. It's the case that a lot of the guerrilla warfare endeavors in the first century, which led to the destruction of the temple, took inspiration from the Maccabees. They remembered themselves 200 years prior, this family resisted the Seleucids and won. We can do the same thing, but they failed horribly. Which is how we got the diaspora and 2,000 years of exile. So high stakes for him to talk about battles of minority versus a majority, especially when that majority is an empire.
But he does also talk about the fighting, internal fighting in Jerusalem.
Right.
And I think that people don't take kindly to.
Very good. So in the war which he lived through, the nature of the war, the rabbis later spun the war of 66 to 70, as a war of Jews versus Romans. Right? That's a lie. Although the Romans were obviously involved, the war was predominantly and overwhelmingly a war of Jews versus Jews. Because you had an increasing conflict between two predominant versions of Jewish life in the first century, in Josephus's lifetime, one of which called themselves the Pirushim, the separatists, who weren't too comfortable with the temple and weren't too comfortable with the priesthood, and gradually moved away from the temple and its worship. And the other ones, who called themselves the Siddukim, the righteous ones, who were obsessed with the temple, with the priesthood, and with all of the things that go with it. The oversimplification, but there was nonetheless kind of two major trends in Jewish life in the period after the Maccabees, before Josephus's own lifetime. And those two trends caused a real conflict that is only partially provoked by Rome. Right? The conflict actually starts between Jews. Rome gets involved as usual because all Rome cares about is people being quiet. And so they come to put down a rebellion and they get embroiled in, and it gets very messy very quickly. At the end stage of the war in 70, the reality is, after 4 years of war, the Jews have mostly lost. And in 70, all the people that are left fighting are holed up in the temple itself in Jerusalem, the temple compound. They have, thanks to the generous donations of some wealthy members of the community, enough food, water, clothing, and animals to live through an entire year of siege, and they plan to hunker down for an entire year. However, the extremist sect among them, who call themselves the Zealots, the Kanaim, the zealous ones, decide that the people in the temple who are planning for a siege are not sufficiently angry about Rome, and in order to get them to fight and make a last stand, they should burn all the food. And so that's what they do. And it gets really bad. And, there's lots of stories that are retold and told afterwards by Josephus and others about cannibalism, about civil violence inside the siege of the temple. Eventually, the Romans get closer and closer, and young Vespasian is the one leading the charge and ends up negotiating with one rabbi, a guy named Yochanan ben Zakkai, for his safe exit from Jerusalem along with 5 students, and they escape and everyone else is killed, so it seems. The rabbis, meaning our entire tradition, us as Jews today, and every other Jew everywhere in the world basically, is traces their lineage back to the fact that that one rabbi got out of the siege of Jerusalem by negotiating with the emperor, making a compromise with Vespasian, and fleeing from the siege. Something that would be seen, I'm sure, as being a traitor at the time. But if he hadn't done that, then Judaism largely would have been lost, and it would have remained, as Josephus imagined, something in the past. So there's a very sensitive element here that the model of the Maccabees ends up becoming something which influences very dramatically life in the first century. So it's important that we understand what actually happened during the time of the Maccabees. Now, notably, the story of the Maccabees is not in our Tanakh. It's not in the Tanakh at all. It probably could have been, although most of the Tanakh was kind of finalized in like the 4th, 3rd century before the Maccabees. It probably could have been slapped in later and nobody would have noticed, but it wasn't. And actually, it was the book of the Maccabees that was written during the time was so little studied by Jews that there is no existing Hebrew version of it. The only version we have is a Greek version because someone made a translation of it. And it did make its way into the Catholic Bible as part of what's called the Apocrypha, but not into the Jewish or Protestant Bible. So there is actually several books of the Maccabees, which were written during the time of the Maccabees or shortly after, which we didn't preserve. We, the rabbinic Judaism that descends from Yochanan ben Zakkai. So what I want to do now is look at some quotes from that, which is actually about 100 BCE. I'm just going to pull out a few things here. It's actually quite long. Because this is the oldest source we have about what happened, and it's interesting to see how it mutates into all the things we've seen above. So again, this is originally in Greek. Well, it was originally in Hebrew, but we don't have the Hebrew. We only have the Greek. So it's translating to English here in a very old-fashioned translation. I apologize for that. I don't understand Greek, so I'm reliant on other people's translations. So it starts, and these are quotes from chapter 1, about Alexander. Alexander the Great ruled for 12 years, then died, and his servants bare rule every one in his place. And after his death, they all put crowns upon themselves. So did their sons after them many years, and evils are multiplied in the earth. He uses language that sounds a lot like Bible language, Genesis language even. And there came out of them a wicked root, Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, son of Antiochus the king, who had been a hostage at Rome, and he reigned in the 137th year of the kingdom of the Greeks. So this is where we get the information about the king of the Seleucids, a guy named Antiochus, and his surname here, Epiphanes, means God is made manifest in me, which implies that he had attempted to have himself deified as a god while he was still living, which was very unfashionable. After you're dead, everyone gets deified in this culture probably as part of the pantheon, but while you're still living is very cheeky. So it implies he was quite a religious person and was very interested in kind of religious things, the fact that he's surnamed Epiphanes. In those days, went there out of Israel wicked men, who persuaded many, saying, Let us go and make a covenant with the heathen that are round about us, for since we departed from them, we have had much sorrow. So this device pleased them well. Then certain of the people were so forward herein, that they went to the king, who gave them a license to do after the ordinances of the heathen, whereupon they built a palace of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the customs of the heathen, and made themselves uncircumcised, and forsook the holy covenant, and joined themselves to the heathen, and were sold to do mischief. So we met Antiochus, but actually, who's the bad guy?
The Jews.
What kind of Jews? What do we learn about these Jews?
They're assimilationist Jews.
That's right. That's right. What does that mean, though? Well, we say that word a lot, assimilation. It's both in good and bad senses. What do they mean by it here, and how did this text understand what they were trying to do?
They become Greeks.
Why?
Or use Greek culture, put it that way.
Yeah. I notice the language, right? That let us go and make a covenant with the heathen. No better crime against God in the eyes of this text than making a covenant, the thing which belongs between the people and God, between the people and this guy, Antiochus, who thinks he's God. So it's really, really cutting the knife very deep. But it's Jews who are doing it, right? They are the ones that are worried. Since we departed from them, we've had so much sorrow. There's evidently some economic or political benefit to being Hellenized, assimilated in that way. And so the wicked men of Israel went and said to the king, we want to do what you guys do. And they went and built a palace of exercise at Jerusalem, according to the customs of the heathen. They built a gymnasium, right, an outdoor stadium in which naked Olympic type games would take place, which is very common. Every good city has one. They turned Jerusalem itself into a Greco-Roman, Syrian, Seleucid, Alexandrian city. So the crime is not just against the culture, but against the landscape, which is significant, right? And not only against the landscape of the place, but against their bodies. They made themselves uncircumcised. There's quite a bit of actually historical evidence for this. Circumcision, this gets a bit technical and graphic, but circumcision originally did not involve the part that it does now. Circumcision originally was only the kind of removal of the very edge of the foreskin. Oh, not quite, but part of the foreskin, not the entirety of it. It was only milah and not what we now do, which is milah and something called priyah. The reason that we do the second part of that today as part of Brit Milah is precisely because if you don't do it, it's possible to stretch the foreskin and thus make it seem as though you are uncircumcised, which is the great crime of the people then. There's all these stories from other texts about how these Jewish men were putting weights on their penis in order to stretch out the foreskin so that they could go to the gymnasium, because of course you go naked, and act like everyone else and be like everyone else. And that's a symbol in many ways of the covenant. The circumcision is a symbol of the covenant, and thus its inversion by people trying to undo it is a symbol of precisely what's wrong. This isn't the empire doing bad things to us, right? This is some of the Jews were collaborating actively and passionately with the empire to try and make Judaism invalid and make Jerusalem unholy and make their bodies no longer have the symbol of the covenant.
Is this text still Josephus Flavius?
No, sorry, this is the book of Maccabees.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So this is the oldest narration of it, and I think in many ways the most reliable because it's from the time period, and you can see that they give us a lot more information about what's going on than all the people who come later who are nervous about talking about the real story, which seems to be that this is about a conflict between some Jews and others, Hellenizers versus non-Hellenizers. We'll see in a minute who the Maccabees are in this context. It's not exactly who we expect. So after 2 years, there's 2 years that go on. After 2 years fully expired, the king sent his chief collector of tribute, that's the taxman, unto the cities of Judah, that's the province, who came to Jerusalem with a great multitude, and spoke peaceable words unto them, but all was deceit. For when they had given him credence, he fell suddenly upon the city, and smote it very sore, and destroyed much people of Israel. And when he had taken the spoils of the city, he set it on fire, and pulled down the houses and walls thereof on every side. So something happens with a guy who's a tax collector. There's other records of this, again, in Greek sources. His name was Tobias, or actually in Hebrew, Tuvia, which tells you he's a Jew, who's working for the empire, who comes to collect taxes and exacts such a heavy economic burden that actually the people really suffer as a result, so much so that it leads to the spoil and destruction of the city in some way. Fire, spoiling. They talk in the next section about women and children are taken captive, they possess the cattle, they build the city of David with a great and strong wall with mighty towers and made it a stronghold for them. So they actually built a fortress in Jerusalem, in what's called the city of David, and they put therein a sinful nation, wicked men, and fortified themselves therein. They stored it with armor and victuals, and when they had gathered together the spoils of Jerusalem, they laid them up there, and so they became a sore snare. For it was a place to lie in wait against the sanctuary, an evil adversary to Israel. So this leads to there being a kind of alt temple built in Jerusalem, next door to the temple. And it gets worse. Thus they shed innocent blood on every side of the sanctuary and defiled it, insomuch that the inhabitants of Jerusalem fled because of them, whereupon the city was made a habitation of strangers and became strange to those that were born in her, and her own children left her. Now, all of this is language from Jeremiah, from 600 years prior, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and exiled the upper classes of the Judean people. This is kind of very much a quote from the language of Lamentations of Jeremiah, and you can see a similar story. And just like in those stories, the bad guy isn't just the evil empire from outside, but the people, the Jews, who were willing to collaborate with them. Note how they describe King Antiochus. He wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, and everyone should leave his laws, so that all the heathen agreed according to the commandment of the king. Yeah, many of the Israelites consented to his religion, and sacrificed unto idols, and profaned the Sabbath. For the king had sent letters by messengers unto Jerusalem and the cities of Judah, that they should follow the strange laws of the land, and he forbid burnt offerings and sacrifice and drink offerings in the temple, that they should profane the Sabbath and festival days, and pollute the sanctuary and holy people, set up altars and groves and chapels of idols, and sacrifice swine's flesh and unclean beasts. So, not only does the king say, you shouldn't do your own practices, we're going to do what everyone does, which, by the way, again, Hellenism is a belief of toleration and multiculturalism. From the point of view of the Seleucids, this is multiculturalism. Everyone has the same religion. We're all going to partake in each other's religion. This is Jews who are being intransigent here. But it does say that many people went along with this. Many of the Israelites consented, sacrificed unto idols, profaned the Sabbath, etc. Right? He ruled they should leave their children uncircumcised, make their souls abominable with all sorts of uncleanness and profanation, in order that they might forget the law and change all the ordinances. And whoever would not do according to the commandment of the king, he said, he would die. In the selfsame manner he wrote to the whole kingdom, and appointed overseers over all the people, commanding the cities of Judah to sacrifice city by city. And many of the people were gathered unto them, to wit, everyone that forsook the law, and so they committed evils in the land, and drove the Israelites into secret places, even wheresoever they could flee for succor. I love this old-fashioned English. So the majority are collaborating, right? Many of the people were gathered unto them. Everyone who forsook the law, everyone's violating Shabbat, everyone's sacrificing pigs, everyone's trying to stretch out their foreskin. The narrative of this text is very much that the majority of the people were going along with this program of assimilation and Hellenization. Okay, so that's the kind of setup. Just want to look a little bit at chapter 2 here. This is a section of chapter 2, which tells us about the Maccabees. And then meanwhile, the king's officers, such as compelled the people to revolt, came into the city Modi'in, still a city today in central Israel, to make them sacrifice. And when many of Israel came unto them, Matityahu also and his sons came together. Then answered the king's officers and said to Matityahu on this, you are a ruler and an honorable and great man in the city, and strengthened with sons and brethren. So clearly he was someone important, this guy Matityahu. Now therefore come first and fulfill the king's commandment, like as all the heathen have done, and the men of Judah also, and such as remain at Jerusalem. So shall you and your house be in the number of the king's friends, and you and your children shall be honored with silver and gold and many rewards. So they find Matityahu, clearly a man of stature. We know he's the son of the high priest. And they say, we know you're important, so we want you to be the one to sacrifice the animals first. Because that way you'll set a good example. You'll be the king's friend. Everyone will be okay. He responds, though all the nations that are under the king's dominion obey him and fall away from the religion of their fathers and give consent to his commandments, yet will I and my sons and my brethren walk in the covenant of our fathers. God forbid that we should forsake the law and the ordinances. We will not hearken to the king's words to go from our religion, either on the right hand or the left. Again, biblical language. Don't stray to the right or the left. That's what Moses says. Now when he had left speaking these words, there came one of the Jews, in the sight of all, to sacrifice on the altar which was at Modi'in, according to the king's commandment. Which thing when Matityahu saw, he was inflamed with zeal, that's the zealots, and his reins trembled, don't know what that means, neither could he forbear to show his anger according to judgment, wherefore he ran and slew him upon the altar. Right, this guy goes to sacrifice an animal, The king's soldiers are standing there going, listen, we need you to sacrifice to prove that you're loyal. Mattityahu won't do it. Someone else goes to do it. And Mahiyahu goes and kills him on the altar. And the king's commissioner who compelled the men to sacrifice, he killed at that time also. And the altar he pulled down. Thus he dealt zealously for the law of God, like this is meant to be Pinchas, did unto Zimri, they didn't get the names right in the Greek, the son of Salom, that's not the name. And Mattityahu cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, whoever is zealous of the law and maintains the covenant, let him follow me. So he and his sons fled into the mountains and left all that they ever had in the city. So that's just the beginning of the book, but very different story. What is this story about? And who is Mattityahu, the father of the Maccabees? His son Judah becomes the leader of the rebellion along with his brothers, the Hammers. Who are they? What are they about? What do they want to do?
A bit of an extremist group. Basically, not like just from reading this, just like if you have to follow our kind of way, otherwise you will take other people down with you, kind of thing. So, but it sounds quite extreme that he preferred to kill someone on the altar. Yeah,
he killed a person, another Jew on the altar, rather than do what Antiochus wanted him to do.
Yeah,
which again is what the zealots in the war in 70 CE are exactly going to do. They'd rather kill Jews than surrender.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely our definition of extremism in many ways, and zealotry, and what today might be called religious fundamentalism in some way.
Yeah.
Now, it's a bit more complicated because obviously these are our fundamentalists. So we're sympathetic, of course. They want to preserve Judaism. They want to make sure that the king isn't making them observe a different religion. They're standing up for what they believe. Wonderful, right? We celebrate that. But in an objective context, in a non-Jewish context, what they're doing is not terribly different than other religious, fundamentalist, extremist groups. The group they inspire 200 years later, the Zealots, actually begin the first suicide terrorism in the history of human society. The Zealots in Jerusalem in 70 start assassinating people in the market in order to be arrested by the police, in order to be crucified, so they can say that their crucifixion is part of the war against Rome. They want to be killed and crucified, which is the punishment for rebellious leaders, in order to say that they are serving God and fighting against the evil powers. But the people they're killing are Jews.
There's also, I don't know if the story is connected to this period, but with the Hannah and her 7 sons. So it's a very similar kind of, I think it's the same time, basically. If you don't do what we say, I don't have the words in English for all this, but then one by one they kill them all, and it's the same kind of attitude of extremism. It's tricky because it's obviously a bit different than we usually think about the Maccabees, who are glorious freedom fighters in our mind. But you can see a little bit, just looking back, why it is that maybe the rabbis were kind of keen to play down this element of the story. Remember, our rabbis, the ones who wrote that passage in the Talmud that said, it's about magic oil. They're the same ones who were the ones to escape from the siege, who clearly didn't agree with the Zealots. They're the same ones who were separatists, who didn't like the temple, who were trying to separate from the temple. They're not too keen to celebrate these guys who were zealous for the temple, for sacrifices, for the priesthood, for oil, for the menorah. That's not their game at all. But people are already celebrating this holiday. In Josephus' time, 500 years earlier, people are celebrating a holiday. He doesn't really know why. He doesn't know why they call it what they call it, but people are doing it. So the rabbis can't say, don't do Hanukkah. But instead they say, do Hanukkah. It's about this thing, not that thing. They don't want us to think about it as being about these extremist zealots who were killing other Jews because they violated the covenant. This is about Jews killing other Jews, particularly Jews killing assimilated Jews, on the basis of the fact that they're worse than the enemies.
It does seem, I mean, one of the things they were, I don't know, getting upset about, putting it mildly, is, you know, people sacrificing pigs or other whatever unkosher animals, and yet surely in effect sacrificing a human has got to be a lot worse than that.
Yeah.
You know, killing someone on the altar because
the poetry of it is
that's what God wants, which is, I don't know, hard to, well, I mean, I suppose it goes with the extremist idea, but it's hard to fathom.
Yeah, it is pretty grim. And of course, what's funny about this in a historical long distance way is that these guys win, right? The Maccabees do successfully stage a guerrilla warfare revolt against the Seleucids. They manage to eventually get themselves in a position with enough support from the countryside that they can retake Jerusalem, rededicate the temple. Maybe there was some magic oil, maybe there wasn't. And they end up actually founding a dynasty that restores sovereignty to the land of Israel, very briefly. And within a generation, maybe 2 generations, that dynasty, the Hashmonaim, become the most assimilated, most Greek Jewish rulers of the kingdom there ever was. So it clearly doesn't really work, their strategy, because their own descendants end up being the ones who go the furthest from what they intended. But what's interesting is how to understand who these people were. Now, something that really struck me is I found this paper on the internet some years ago, and I realized it's very bright in comparison. But you can see, I found this PDF, Operational Issues of Insurgency and Counterinsurgency in the Maccabean Revolt. This is a paper, as you can see, that was written for the School of Advanced Military Studies at Fort Leavenworth in America by a major, looking at the historical events of the Maccabean Revolt and understanding its role in counterinsurgency efforts. This is 1997, right? Long before the counterinsurgencies of the American military post-2001. But it becomes very relevant, and this paper gets cited a lot by generals after the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq, because the paper is about how does an occupying empire respond to a religious fundamentalist threat. And of course, the religious fundamentalist threat, their understanding, is the Maccabees. So he said some amazing things, and I just pulled out a few things here just to point your attention to, particularly this quote, which really struck me. Right? For most revolts from the religious right do not draw their ideology and objectives purely from issues of faith. Rather, the ideology and objectives are a mixture of religious beliefs, secular grievances, and the violence, hatred, and enmity that grow out of the struggle. The keys to defeating a revolt from the religious right, which the Seleucid Empire failed to do, are first, to decouple the religious from the secular issues, and second, to avoid excessive use of force, which normally drives more people into the insurgency. Absolutely true. Unfortunately, the Americans didn't take this advice from the Seleucid Empire, because they did exactly this thing in invading Afghanistan and Iraq, which was use too much force and make it about religion. But it's amazing that a scholar in the 21st century looked at the Maccabean Revolt, the exact thing which inspires our observation of Hanukkah, and understood from it the modern context of contemplating religious insurgencies in war zones. He points out here interesting explanation about what he understands to be the background of the Maccabean Revolt. He has a very general view, which is here. The Hellenizing Jews did not intend to violate the Mosaic law. They sought to incur the social, political, and economic benefits of Hellenism without adopting the religious trappings. From a cosmopolitan Hellenistic point of view, this should not have been impossible. However, from a devout Jewish point of view, it was an anathema. So, in other words, he sees it, and again, this is a military strategy scholar, but he sees it that actually the Jews who are the baddies of the original Maccabean story were simply trying to get the benefit of working with the empire without adopting their religious views. But they were stopped from doing that by these extremist nutjobs from the countryside who called themselves the Hammer, who came down and destroyed them and assassinated them and eventually went on this war of guerrilla redemption to try and bring back the temple, which they succeeded in. It was a successful insurgency. But it's really fascinating for us today to go all the way back to our own time to think about what Hanukkah means to us. When we light the menorah and we talk about the miracle of the oil, we're very much tapping into the rabbis here who weren't too comfortable with the Maccabees as a character, with the real events of the story. They liked the idea of religious freedom, but didn't like the idea that it came about through fundamentalist warfare. And so they reframed it as a story about a miracle and about oil, and ignored all the stuff about Jews killing other Jews. And it's really quite a nice way to do it. I support that entirely. I'm all here for the miracle, even though I don't think it happened, because I think it's about retelling a story in a way that makes it relevant to the modern world. But as much as we tell that story, we also live now in 2021 with a Jewish community that again has sovereignty in the land of Israel, and with a division in Israel between Jews who think that other Jews are too assimilated, too adapted to Western society. There is a huge amount of violence from some Jews against other Jews, and it's growing all the time. And you can see it every time you look at the newspapers in Israel, that there's these young guys with towels wrapped around their faces and slingshots out in the West Bank who are attacking Israeli soldiers because they think that the soldiers are not defending the real version of Judaism, the real version of the Torah, the real version of Judea, and only they are. And not only are they tapping into this long history of conflict between assimilation and fundamentalism, but they are reliving and inspired by the Maccabees in a way that's very dangerous. So I think as long as we're happy to continue talking about the oil, I'm cool with that. But we can't ignore the fact that actually the story is a story about religious right-wing violence, and that's not something that only exists in the past. And if we want to understand how to respond to it today in Judaism, we have to think about where it started and how it's developed and all the things that have gone into that. So we can't only talk about the oil, even if we do consciously try and reframe it that way. The miracle maybe is that we can still celebrate this holiday, considering how much has been wrapped up in it over all these years, and how many of us would feel very differently. And the irony of Hanukkah is perhaps that of all the Jewish holidays, Hanukkah is the one that is most associated with assimilation, that is practiced by most Jews in a secular context, and that most non-Jews know something about. Yet it is the holiday that its origins is the most about fighting the integration of Jews into the world around them, including by violence. So we hold in our menorah two very conflicting narratives, as David said when we began this evening. There's two stories here which don't really work that well together, but both are very relevant. And I think we should keep talking about the oil and keep talking about miracles and faith and freedom, but not forget about the fact that actually the violence is still very much with us and not just something in the past. Even if we ignore it, even if we pretend it's not there, we're not doing ourselves any favors because it hasn't gone away. So, sorry, Debbie.
But where does the miracle of the oil come from then? Does that just start with the rabbis?
Yeah, they just made it up.
Years later.
Yeah. The rabbis have a ideological job of reframing a lot of Jewish history in a way that will make it more acceptable and less violent. And remember, the rabbis are entirely descendant from the few people who survived the siege by compromising with the Roman general. Not something the Maccabees ever would have done. Yochanan ben Zakkai goes out of the siege and says to Vespasian, if you let me leave and leave me in peace, then we'll never bother you again. I'm sure that every other person in that siege thought he was a horrible traitor. And yet if it weren't for him, we wouldn't be here today. None of our rabbinic tradition would be here today. There would be no Judaism today. So it's a very fine line for the rabbis to walk in accepting Jewish history and tradition, while also not encouraging what they see as the worst parts of it. And so they definitely just rewrite history in this regard and reinterpret Hanukkah as about something that was never mentioned previously.
So, but then why would people have been lighting lights or whatever it was they were lighting that Josephus was talking about? If the idea about lights came much later, why would people have commemorated what happened by lighting lights?
It's a good question as to which kind of comes first in some way. It is possible. I don't want to completely disregard the fact that the oil story might be older. Josephus gives us a hint, as you say, that they're thinking about lights. But again, one of the things that was central to the temple was the menorah, the temple menorah. It had 7 branches, 6 plus 1. And it may be that simply that was what they took away from it. It clearly was a big symbol of the Maccabees because they used the menorah on their coins. When we find coinage and art from the Maccabean period, it always has the symbol of the menorah on it. So it may have simply been that the menorah was the Maccabees symbol, and as a result, people lit lamps in remembrance of them. We can see some hint, those who have been taking the Hebrew class with me, you can see some hint as to this, because the first halakha about what do we do on Hanukkah is actually not that we light 8 lights, but that we light a lamp each night of Hanukkah. We light some kind of light, 1 candle each night of Hanukkah. If you only light 1 candle each night, not more, not less, just 1 each night for 8 nights, you're fulfilling the obligation of Hanukkah, the rabbis say, which means actually the menorah that we know actually comes later. So there's lights earlier, but not necessarily the Chanukiah. That's a relatively new idea.
Mhm.
And they made it 8 days because of Sukkot.
Yes.
Tradition.
Yeah, it seems that way. Because Sukkot was not celebrated that year, 8 days of sacrifices were kind of ordained as a replacement for Sukkot.
It just seems hard to then base your festival around that miracle idea when it could well have been just made up how many hundreds of years later.
Yeah.
And it's not really celebrating or commemorating or whatever.
No. No, I mean, I see that, and I think that in some ways, I think it's okay for us to say that things are not true and yet they're meaningful. That actually the way of retelling the story may not be historically accurate, but is nonetheless the better way to tell the story. I think there's also a way in which Hanukkah can be understood as a bit of a warning as well, that when we remember this event and we celebrate it, we're also remembering all the dangerous aspects of what this way of thinking can lead to. And I think that's okay too. I mean, a little bit of celebration of the Maccabees because they were victorious makes sense, but there's a fine line between going, yeah, good thing we won, and thinking about how we got there. I do think there's a reason that Hanukkah is meant to be a very minor festival. The rabbis play it down over and over and over. There's no work restrictions. There's no celebrations. All you're meant to do is light a light each night to mark the fact that it's happening. And I think the fact that Hanukkah has become such a big part of Jewish life in the 21st century in the West, thanks to Christmas, actually is a bit of a problem, because it makes it seem like Hanukkah is very important, but for the rabbis, it actually wasn't that important. They would have much rather you spend all your time thinking about Pesach and talking about freedom from Egypt, rather than thinking about Hanukkah and the Maccabees, who are very complicated and kind of dark characters, actually.
Yeah, but really, people, in the normal life, normal life now, I mean, people do not think Hanukkah is a happy holiday, generally speaking. I mean, people do not realize that really there is all that war behind it. We all know that, there was a war and so forth, but not to that extent.
Yeah.
I mean, Hanukkah, for people, generally speaking, is an happy holiday. The children are enjoying it.
Yeah, I'm not trying to ruin Hanukkah for anyone. It's not the war on Hanukkah.
Really, I mean, when you say to children Hanukkah, they don't think of war, they don't think of battle.
No. No, and then in that way, I think the rabbis were very successful, right? That retelling of the story as being about a miracle and about perseverance and about victory, but in a different sense. They were very successful because that is how most people think about it, and I don't think that's bad. But I do think it's important that we realize that it's not the whole picture. So I'm sorry if I've spoiled Hanukkah for anyone.
No, it's spoiled. I mean, I knew,
Yeah, of course.
superficially, but at the same time, it doesn't spoil it. It's quite interesting, really. Everybody should know about the background. We all have an idea. We all know about Matatau, and we know about, but not to that extent. I mean, I didn't realize that. I mean, I know Jews are human beings, but human being, of course. But what I mean is, they are human, like with the good and the bad of other human. But I never realized that they would be fighting to that extent, killing each other. And it's understandably not something that we bring to the forefront of it, but it is very important for us to
if we get the chance to think about and to acknowledge that it's part of the story, because it hasn't gone away, and there is still quite a bit of the same kind of thinking in Jewish life today, and there's every reason it could come back. So I think there's definitely a relevance to Hanukkah, even if it's not a full picture that we usually think about. And I'm glad, as always, to get a better sense of all the layers that go into Jewish development, because it's very rich and very variegated, and I think that's a good thing. So thank you for joining me to think a little bit about Hanukkah and the Maccabees. I don't encourage you to become a right-wing religious fundamentalist, but I do encourage you to celebrate Hanukkah and to think about all the different layers of that story that we've told and all the things it's meant to different people over the years, and to enjoy the wonderfulness of all the fried food, which is, of course, the main attraction. So in 1 week's time, may it come to us for good. All the fried food will be ours. And in the meantime, Hanukkah Sameach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.